everybody. Good morning. My name is Russ. I'm the director of Sanctuary here at Black Rock Church. And if you're not sure what Sanctuary is, it's a service for young adults. That's only part of what we do, but it's a good thing. 5 p.m. in this very room tonight, and every Sunday for the rest of all time, we will meet here and have a young adult service. 18 to 35 is the target age range, but if you come, we won't check your ID or anything. You're free to come check it out, come join us, and I hope you join us on our Biblical Relationships series that we're starting last week. So you're not going to get behind, though, because I'm going to give you a little bit of a teaser today, all right? So you may know at this point in your life, when you go through something dangerous, something life-threatening, or something painful, it gives you the opportunity to get closer to the people that you're with. For example, when I was dating the girl who would become my wife, all right, I'm about to throw out a lot of names. If you're taking notes, write down the names. If not, doesn't matter, all right? Just go with it. All right, my wife's name is Bree. We were dating. She lives in upstate New York, or she did at the time. Outside of Auburn. If you've never heard of it before, it's fine. And so we went to go on a double date with my future brother-in-law and future sister-in-law. It's Bree's sister and her husband, Maddie. And this is like early 2010s, if not 2010 itself. And there's not a lot to do in this town, so we decided to go on a double date bowling, which, woo, let's go. Upstate New York, we're going to bowl, right? There's pretty much nothing else unless you want to go, like, push cows over or something. So, we go bowling, and we get in Maddie's car. Now, Maddie, my future brother-in-law, is not known to be a safe driver. He has a plethora of speeding tickets, and he drives really fast, which is what it is, But the cool thing at this point, I'm not sure if it's still cool. I probably think it's still cool. I do think it's still cool, is to have giant subwoofers in your car. All right, so his trunk was completely taken up by subwoofers. It was a useless trunk at that point. So the four of us get in his car, and we go to head towards the bowling alley. And the thing about, if you don't know anything about subwoofers, not a big deal. It just meant that we couldn't hear each other in the car. So Bree was sitting right next to me. I was cupping my hands around my mouth like I was shouting across the room, but she's right next to me. I was like, "You look great," right? She's like, "What?" Yeah, that was like, we couldn't talk in the car. So we're flying down the road, and we come to this intersection. And it's such a weird intersection. I've never come across one of these before, but it had a green light and nobody was moving. And there was an open lane on the left. And so my aggressive driving brother-in-law decided he was going to go through the open lane and fly through the intersection, because why not, right? And so we fly up to the intersection, past all those suckers. We're like, "Ha, see you later," right? Because we're flying by, they're all standing still. And then right as we get to the intersection, all of a sudden my brother-in-law slams on the brakes, and I imagine we screeched to a stop because I actually couldn't hear anything besides the bass. So screech! And I'm having heart palpitations already from the subwoofers. And so we screeched to a stop, and then all of a sudden, right in front of us, a fire truck flies the other way through the intersection. And this is what I did. Ah! Right? Woo! I feel good, right? Oh, man, this is what I wanted energy drinks to do. I was smelling gravity. It was incredible. I felt so good. I was like, let's back it up and do it again, right? Why not? This is great. We all felt so good at that point. Man, you know what feels good? Living, all right? And so we all look back on this time. We're like, yeah, remember that time where we lived? I was the boy who lived, right? I felt so good. And it was one of those things that it provided, this life-threatening situation, provided us with an opportunity to get to know each other better. It was something we always had to reflect on, except that it was like 3 out of the 4 of us, because my sister-in-law was so traumatized, she didn't remember anybody else being there. So I say it's an opportunity. It is not guaranteed, but it's an opportunity. And this same principle applies to not only going through dangerous or life-threatening or painful times with each other, but it also applies to Jesus. When we go through painful or difficult or life-threatening times with Jesus, it provides us an opportunity to get to know him better. I teased you a little bit about the series we're in about biblical relationships. And so come tonight if you want to see what the biblical relationship is tonight that we're going to pull spiritual and relational insights out of. But today, the relationship that I want to talk about is between Jesus and his disciples. And the passage we're going to look at to pull out these relational and spiritual principles is Luke 8, 22 through 25. If you have your Bible, open it up Otherwise, it's going to be on the screen. It's in the NIV. If you want to read along word for word exactly what it says, you'll find it there. Here we go. You guys ready? Oh, good. I'm ready too. Great. Here we go. 22. Luke 8, verse 22 to 25. One day, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let's cross to the other side of the lake." So they got into a boat and started out. As they sailed across, Jesus settled down for a nap. But soon a fierce storm came down on the lake. The boat was filling with water, and they were in real danger. The disciples went and woke him up, shouting, "Master, Master, we're going to drown!" When Jesus woke up, he rebuked the wind and the raging waves. Suddenly, the storm stopped and all was calm. Then he asked them, "Where's your faith?" The disciples were terrified and amazed. "Who is this man?" they asked each other. When he gives a command, even the wind and the waves obey him. All right. This is one of those passages. I grew up in the church from the time I was a little kid. I've read this tons of times. I've heard it taught on tons of times. I've heard it read. I listened to the audio Bible a bunch. It's one of those passages, because it's so familiar, I stopped asking questions about it. And so it's crazy, when I was studying for this, asking questions about it, I learned all sorts of stuff. Who knew, right? So my challenge to you is, as maybe even you leave here today or throughout the week, go back and read this passage and just ask questions. Ask questions that even seem silly and see what the Holy Spirit reveals to you. You'll be amazed at what you learn. It's super cool. So some questions I asked that also help set the scene. I was just asking really basic questions. I want to give you some of my questions about the scene that this is set in, and then we'll talk about the spiritual principles in a minute. But this was a real place. This is a real place. It still exists. It's called the Sea of Galilee. And I got a couple of things I just want to talk about because I thought they were really interesting, and I hope you think they're interesting too. So here we go. The Sea of Galilee is also known as Lake Tiberias, is also known as a whole bunch of names because the name was constantly changing based on who the ruling country was, the ruling nation was around the water. And what do you think of when you think of sea? When you hear the word sea, what's something that comes to mind? Somebody shout something out. Wait, okay, that's too much. Someone say it louder. Oh, water, that's fair. Anybody else? A sea of people. All right, anybody else? All right. See, I was looking for the answer salt, but you guys did great, all right? Because when I think of the sea, I think of salt, right? No one's like, "Hey, you know what I really want on my spaghetti is lake salt." No one's asking for lake salt. And I'm like, man, I always figured the Sea of Galilee was salt water, but it's fresh water. You know? Incredible. I had no idea. I always figured it was salt water. Okay, here we go. Keep going. The point at which Jesus and his disciples were leaving from to cross the lake was 5 miles across. I don't really know what 5 miles looks like, but I do know what the sound looks like. So if you go and you stand at Penfield Beach or Jennings and Fairfield and you look across, a lot of us have had this experience, you look across the sound, what do you see? You see Long Island in the distance, right? From where you're standing over there to Long Island is between 15 and 18 miles across. So in my head, when I read this story, I was like, wow, Jesus is asking his disciples to go so far. I imagine like you see the curvature of the earth, like the horizon, it's just water. They're going to this distant planet, right? They're going so far. But no, it's a third of the distance across the sound. And that was mind-blowing to me. I was like, wow, Jesus actually gave them like a SMART goal. It was something they could actually accomplish. It was close. They could see where they were going. And the Sea of Galilee is known for just these wild, really spontaneous, violent storms. I was talking to Bruce. He hosts our online services before the service started. He was saying that he actually went to the Sea of Galilee and was right on it on a boat. It was like crystal clear like glass, he said, no waves. And then 15 minutes later, there's this huge storm that came through and these giant waves coming around. I was like, wow, it still does it today. And I don't know anything about like the topography of the land or whatever, but I do know that this is the second lowest lake in the world. It's 600 to 700 feet below sea level. So I imagine all the land in the area is kind of coming down to this funnel point that is the lake. So it makes sense. I don't really know anything about weather, but I imagine all the weather like whipping around and coming down to that fine point, that low point. It makes sense to me why it would be stormy, I guess. All right, 4 of the disciples on this boat grew up as fishermen. They grew up in this coastal town right on the side of the sea. And they fish for their food, for their well-being. They fish for their work, and then they go on the water for fun. And I try to look up what life was like for someone in this area, but there's nothing until about 1,000 years later. And 1,000 years later, it says people who grow up in these types of towns, their whole life is on the water. Their fun is on the water, their work is on the water, their food is on the water. Their whole life revolves around the water. And then they also tell these stories. And you grow up hearing these stories about tragedy and all this other stuff because it taught them lessons about how they were supposed to behave near the water, or if they were out on a boat, what they should act like. And then so they also probably knew people who got lost in storms because these violent storms would come through. And maybe they had relatives, or they knew someone in their little village who had gotten swept away and drowned. So they have this like fear from their childhood that's coming true in this passage where they're seeing like, oh no, it's gonna be us. We're being overcome. All right, now the boat. I always imagined this boat was some sort of colonial pirate ship that had like cannons sticking out and a big mast or something. And so I wanted to look it up because I wanted to know like where was Jesus sleeping, right? Because it says he's sleeping in the stern, so I imagine he had like a captain's quarters. And so everything I looked up about boats, I did a deep dive into boats, and I looked at boats from as far back in history as we have until about 500 AD where I found what I wanted. And I found that pretty much everything is a glorified canoe. So I have this picture I want to share with you. This is called the Jesus boat. It was pulled from the Sea of Galilee. In 1989, the Sea of Galilee really went down quite a bit. And it's a first century AD fishing boat. So they call it the Jesus boat. So this would be the type of boat that Jesus would have gone across on. I was thinking maybe there was some sort of bigger ship that he could have gone across on, but that's around 580. There was like a trade barge, and that was probably big enough to not be tossed around. But imagine this like 20-foot boat being tossed around with 12 people in it, right? That's not a huge boat. It's like a glorified canoe. Whose boat was it? I have no idea. No one answers this, right? Ask these types of questions when you read the Bible. Your mind will be blown. And I'm like, man, where was Jesus sleeping? He must have been soaked because they wake up Jesus because the waves are coming over the side of the boat, and Jesus is just sleeping completely soaked. The danger didn't wake Jesus. The disciples did. I'm like, man, Jesus is a deep sleeper. He would be a great parent, right? All right, we're going to pull some spiritual principles from this text. Here we go. Spiritual principle. Difficult circumstances are not evidence of unbelief. Unbelief is a rejection of a promise or command of God for a particular situation. Difficult circumstances are not evidence of unbelief. The storm isn't what bothered Jesus. The difficult circumstance did not bother Jesus. The disciples' lack of faith, their lack of trust did. So question for you, did the disciples trust Jesus? Oh, all right, yes, good job. The disciples did trust Jesus, but the thing is they didn't trust Jesus with their lives because trust isn't binary. It's not a trust or do not trust. It's not a yes or a no. Trust is on a scale. Do I trust my 4-year-old daughter? Yes, with her Hot Wheels. Do I trust my 4-year-old daughter with my financial choices? No, right? Do you trust, you guys right here, do you trust anybody who pulls back a rubber band like this? No, can't trust them, right? You're like, stop pointing at me. Can't trust these guys, all right? You still squint. Trust is on a scale. It's not a do or do not. Let's say it's a scale of 1 out of 10, 1 being the least, 10 being the most. What happens in this passage if the disciples' trust was a 10 out of 10? What would the passage look like? When the disciples went to go cross the lake, what if they followed Jesus' lead, right? He is the teacher after all. They're the disciples. They're supposed to follow his example. His example is taking a nap. So the passage could have read like this. Jesus and his disciples sailed across the Sea of Galilee in a storm by sleeping and trusting God to get them across safely. It would be a miracle passage. We talk about it all the time. It's laughable because that's not how anybody sails, but that's how Jesus planned on sailing. We can trust Jesus' example for us, even if it's unorthodox. He is faithful. We have example after example of people from the Bible that have storms in their lives coming to Jesus with their storm and seeing how Jesus responds. And why this is important is because this is the same way Jesus will respond to us. When the storm comes, we can rest in the trust that the Father will take us safely through. All right, for you note takers, write this down. If your trust in Jesus was 10 out of 10 on the trust scale, how would your response to the storm you were in look differently? You don't make it this far in life. Every single one of you who are in this room right now, you don't make it this far to this service without having some storms in your life. We have all had some serious storms. We've had little storms, big storms, all sorts of storms. You don't make it this far without getting storms. So think about one of those storms, maybe reflect on it later. If your trust in Jesus was a 10 out of 10, how would your response to the storm you were in look differently? Let me give you an example of one of mine. When my second son, his name's Eli, when he was 3 years old, he got sick. It just seemed like a normal virus. It was whatever. When you have little kids, they're always sick. And you're getting it too later. It's the worst. And so he went from being sick to all of a sudden one day his legs just curled up. And he was in really intense pain and he couldn't straighten his legs and he couldn't walk. Me being really smart, I was like, I'll just straighten out his legs, right? And I tried to stretch out his legs. Don't do that if this happens. Don't do that. It's a mistake. Lots of screaming. So we called the doctor. The doctor said, all right, if this continues, bring him into the office tomorrow. Like, all right, cool, whatever. I was carrying him everywhere, and life changed a lot for us really fast. So we go to the doctor because he's not getting any better. I'm still having to carry him everywhere. His legs are still curled up. And the doctor says, all right, well, there's two options of what's going on here. Either one is really common. It's something after a virus that kids could just get, and they lose the ability to walk for a little bit, and they have really intense leg pain. Or this is some debilitating illness, and he's never going to walk again. That's really disconcerting, all right? This is a real-life storm right here. You may not have children, but you may have had a family member who's had one of these types of diagnoses, where it's like, oh man, this could be really life-altering. This could be really bad. This makes the 10 out of 10 trust really hard because this is real life. And I did trust Jesus, and so did my wife. We knew what to do. We knew that we were supposed to give Eli over to Jesus because that's what people did in the Bible, and it worked because they trusted Jesus. And so we give Eli over to Jesus in prayer, and we tell everybody we know. We're like, hey, pray for Eli. Like this could be really serious. But I'd say my trust was probably a 5 out of 10. And the reason why I'd say that is because I was willing to give Eli over to Jesus, but then when I went to go to sleep at night, it was really hard to sleep. I kept thinking I had no peace, I had no sound mind. I was just laying in bed thinking about all the different ways our life were going to change when my son would never walk again. When the storm comes, we can rest in the trust that the Father will take us safely through. It's hard, but we can. Just to complete the story, because I want to move on, it was just that normal thing that the kids get, the common thing. So he's walking around fine. You'll see him later. He's running around crazy. So when the storm comes, we can rest in the trust. The Father is going to take us safely through. He is faithful. Do you trust him? What would your storm look like, even if it's small, if you trusted Jesus 10 out of 10? Trust is something you can grow too. If you're like, man, I don't trust Jesus very much, don't feel bad about this. The disciples didn't either. Your trust can grow. The disciples trusted Jesus, but not with their lives. And then over time they grew. The majority of them gave their lives. Their lives were taken violently from them because of the way they trusted Jesus. And I'm not saying that's the goal. Don't die some sort of violent death for Jesus. But your trust can grow in Jesus. One of the main examples we have from the Bible of going through storms is not to go through them alone. Jesus and the disciples were on the boat together, but the disciples were going through the storm as if Jesus wasn't with them. Like the disciples, we can go through storms like Jesus isn't with us. The spiritual principle we have here is invite Jesus into your storms. Invite Jesus into your storms. Maybe they had one of these mindsets where they're serving Jesus, right? Jesus said, hey, let's go across the lake. So they're like, oh, I'm serving Jesus, so it'd be weird to ask him to help. Maybe that's why they didn't ask Jesus for help. Or maybe they thought, nah, Jesus can't help, or he doesn't want to help. Have you ever thought those about the storms of your life? I know that's something I've thought. So why didn't the disciples ask Jesus to help when the storm first came? The disciples were capable sailors. From experience, they knew they could just rely on their abilities. It helped them in the past. They survived these past storms on the lake. Why couldn't they do it again? Why wouldn't it work now? Jesus was really good, they thought. They're like, man, I'm good at this sailing stuff. You know what Jesus is good at? Jesus is good at this church stuff, right? We heard last week Pastor Dan preaching about how Jesus healed people and cast out demons by merely saying the word. That's all he had to do. But you know what? This wasn't a church service that Jesus was putting on. This was real life. They knew how strong the storms were. They knew people that died from storms like this. This was real life, Jesus. You can't fix this in a service. My storm is real. The disciples are putting their faith and their trust in their abilities and not in Jesus. We see the disciples placing their trust in their abilities and where it gets them. They're about to drown. Their ability to sail, they've maxed it out. They're like, if I just keep trying harder, we'll save ourselves. But the storm is too powerful and they start to lose. The boat starts to get washed over with water, and when they've given up all hope is lost. They're like, this is it. My biggest fear is coming true. We're going to drown here. And they're like, you know what we should do? We should wake up Jesus and let him know he's dead too. Jesus, we're all dead, right? That's a terrible thing to do. He's sleeping. Just let him die in peace, all right? Like don't do that to Jesus, because they didn't think he was going to help. It wasn't like, hey, Jesus, I know you're going to fix this. It was just like, Jesus, I want to let you know you're going to die a horrible death too. Right? But when they invited Jesus into the storm, what happened? Everything changed. We don't need to wait until all hope is lost to invite Jesus into our storms. What would the storm have looked like if, when the storm just came, the disciples invited Jesus to lend a hand? What would the storm have looked like? Jesus wants us to trust him with our storms. It was his idea to go across the lake in the first place, remember? He was like, hey, let's go across the lake. If he wanted to avoid the storm and not be in the storm with us, he could have just walked. Land was an option. He chose to go through the storm with the disciples. When it comes to the storms of life, don't take them on alone. Invite Jesus into your storms. There's this book that I've read all my children at this point. So many times the book's all falling apart. You got to hold it together. The pages are falling out and stuff. It's this book called Quick as a Cricket. And it's this awesome book where this kid is comparing himself to all these different animals. And he has these qualities of these animals. Like he's as quick as a cricket. And he's as sly as a fox. And he's as cute as a bunny or something like that. There's this one called he's as strong as an ox. I feel like, you can toss it up. I feel like it illustrates what it looks like to try to take on a storm by yourself. And then what it looks like to invite Jesus into the storm. We are that little kid in that picture. He's being crushed under the weight of even just the yoke. He could barely even hold that yoke up. He's being crushed. And then he's trying to also pull this big burden behind him. Even if the cart was empty and his burden was super minimal, how hard would it be for that kid to move that thing? But you invite this ox that's meant for this. He wants to be there. He's super strong. That cart's going to move. Jesus wants to come alongside you and bear your burdens, even if it's small. Even if the cart is empty, Jesus wants to help pull it. You don't need to wait for the storm to get out of control. You don't need to wait for the burden to get completely out of control. So how do we invite Jesus into sharing our burdens, using this image as an example? You have to willingly give him ownership of that burden. So if you're that boy pulling it, and you're pushing as hard as you can and hard as you can, you're like, you know what, Jesus? I'm going to let up a little bit, and I'm going to let you push this weight. And that is enacting trust. You are trusting Jesus with that weight to pull it. And if he decides to move left or right or wherever, remember, you're connected together. If you force against him, it's going to be hard. It's going to be harder than just going with him. That's trusting Jesus, letting him take the burden. You give it over to him. You're like, Jesus, I give you this. And then you let off the gas. Let him put forth the effort, and you follow his lead. Last point, before we're done, the disciples' worst fear, their childhood boogeyman of getting lost at sea, was actually coming true. They were like, we're going to be washed overboard, never to be seen again. This is it for us. If their worst fear came true, and they went overboard, and the boat capsized, Jesus would be in the water with them. If your worst fear came true, if my son never walked again, Jesus would be in the water with me. Jesus will be in the water with you, even if your greatest fear, even if the most powerful storm comes and knocks you over and your greatest fear comes true, Jesus will be in the water with you. He's not magnetically connected to the boat. He's going to fall out too. And who would you rather be in the water with than Jesus? Difficult circumstances are not evidence of unbelief. Jesus was the perfect God-man. He walked on earth and he had a difficult life. He came to earth and his own family rejected his message and called him crazy. And then the Pharisees, who were the religious leaders, were supposed to help him, but instead they fought against him every step of the way. He lived a difficult life, but difficult circumstances aren't evidence of unbelief. If you're living in difficult circumstances or there's all these sorts of storms, God is not mad at you. The difficult circumstances aren't because God is mad at you. God is not mad at you. Invite Jesus to come alongside you today in whatever situation you're in. Maybe the situation is the chaos of the kids being home for the summer. Invite Jesus in. Maybe you don't know how you're going to pay rent. Invite Jesus in. Maybe you've got some sort of bad diagnosis. Invite Jesus in. Maybe it's not a big storm, but it's like a slow trickle, like your work is slowly tearing out your soul day after day. Invite Jesus in. Don't wait for the storm to grow. Maybe it's something positive. Maybe you're excited for work. Invite Jesus in. Or maybe you've never invited Jesus before. You've never trusted Jesus before. Invite Jesus in. Even if you're an expert in the field and you have no clue how Jesus could possibly help, because you know how these things always turn out, invite Jesus in. What circumstances are you struggling to trust Jesus with right now? Invite Jesus to come alongside you. If he didn't want to be a part of the storm, he would have walked. But he's choosing to be in the storm with us. Do you trust him enough to share it with him?
Thank you for watching Black Rock Church's Sunday service. We're so glad you found us, and we hope this message made you feel more connected to God. In talking about connection, we find that it's super important for people to be connected to others and to community in order to grow in their faith. So if you're in the area, we invite you to join us to worship in a service. You can find out about our times and locations right here on this webpage. We'd also love to help you connect in a group and find people who can walk alongside you as you continue deepening your understanding and faith. And after you get to know us, you might even like to use your gifts to serve on a team. We believe God gave each of us unique gifts that we can use to serve those around us. One body with many different parts. If you're not able to be here in person, don't worry. We have a great online community and many ways for you to join in virtually and talk to us throughout the week. You can also stay in touch on our website, YouTube channel, Facebook, and Instagram. By visiting our website, you can also easily give your offering one time as an online gift or a reoccurring gift. Just click Give at the top. The Bible tells us that tithing is an important part of our relationship with Jesus, and we want to continue to trust God with our lives and our finances. Well, we are so glad you made the choice to get to know us and view one of our services. We hope that you join us next week. Thanks so much for watching.